The airport was buzzing with activity that morning, a constant hum of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant announcements echoing across the vast terminal. Among the travelers, a young black girl made her way toward the boarding gate, her backpack snug on her shoulders and her boarding pass clutched tightly in her hand. She had been traveling all day, the fatigue from the long journey already beginning to weigh on her, but there was a quiet excitement in her eyes. It wasn't every day that she got to fly first class, even if just for a short trip. As she approached the gate, she glanced around at the crowd, noticing people from all walks of life. Businessmen in sharp suits tapped on their phones impatiently, families with children juggled bags and strollers, and elderly travelers moved slowly, leaning on their canes or the arms of companions. There was something both chaotic and oddly comforting about the scene, a mix of exhaustion, anticipation, and the shared sense that everyone was heading somewhere important. She took a deep breath, feeling that familiar mix of nervousness and thrill that always came before boarding a plane. Once she walked down the jet bridge, the sound of engines and the faint smell of airplane fuel filled the air, mingling with the scent of coffee from a nearby cafe. She could see the first-class section just ahead, with wide leather seats, neat rows, and extra legroom that seemed almost luxurious compared to the crowded economy section behind it. The young girl's heart raced a little. She wasn't used to this level of comfort, but she felt grateful that she could experience it today. She reminded herself that it was not just about comfort, but about the journey and the moments that could unexpectedly happen along the way. As she prepared to find her seat, she noticed an elderly man slowly making his way down the aisle. He was dressed neatly in a modest suit, his silver hair combed carefully, but his movements were slow and deliberate, suggesting that even standing for long periods was a struggle. He scanned the rows of seats with a look of quiet worry, pausing every now and then as he tried to find the number that matched his ticket. It was clear he wasn't familiar with the airport routine. Perhaps it was the first time he had flown, or maybe he just needed a little more help. The girl observed him from a short distance, feeling an immediate sense of empathy. There was something about his careful, hesitant movements that made her heart tug gently. She watched as he struggled slightly to lift his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, his arms trembling with the effort. Around him, passengers continued to move past, absorbed in their own worlds, not noticing the small difficulties he faced. The young girl felt a surge of compassion. She remembered her own grandfather, how he would always move slowly and need patience from others, and she realized that this man deserved that same kindness. It wasn't about herself, not about the first-class experience waiting for her, it was about someone who clearly needed a little help, someone who deserved respect and care. The flight attendant smiled politely, trying to assist him while managing the boarding process efficiently, but the man's discomfort was obvious. He adjusted his glasses, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and took a deep breath as if preparing himself to face the challenge ahead. She noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he held the ticket, and the girl felt an instinctive urge to do something, anything, to make the moment easier for him. She realized that this was one of those quiet, fleeting moments in life when a simple choice could make a big difference, a moment where small acts of humanity mattered more than anything else in the world. She found her own seat in first class, but her eyes kept drifting toward the elderly man. She could see the slight confusion on his face, the uncertainty about where to sit, and the way his shoulders slumped just a little under the weight of traveling alone. The young girl thought about how she would feel if she were in his place, how a gesture of kindness could transform what might otherwise be a stressful, uncomfortable experience into something memorable and meaningful. She felt a small smile tug at her lips, a sense of purpose rising inside her, almost as if she already knew that the journey was going to be about more than just getting from one city to another. Even as passengers continued to board and the flight attendants moved down the aisle, she stayed quietly aware of him, noticing the little details, the way his eyes scanned the seats, the careful way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the patience he showed despite the obvious fatigue. It was in these little observations that she realized how much life could teach in moments of stillness, in acts of patience, in watching someone quietly struggle. She understood, even before stepping forward, that something significant was about to happen, not because of the plane, or the flight, or even the first-class seat, but because human connection was about to take center stage. The elderly man finally stopped in the aisle, looking at the seat numbers with a puzzled expression. His hands shook slightly as he held his ticket, and he squinted at the rows of plush first-class seats in front of him. It was clear he wasn't sure exactly where he was supposed to go, and the crowd of passengers moving past didn't make things any easier. Some people brushed by without noticing him, their faces glued to their phones or conversations, and the man let out a quiet sigh, almost as if he had accepted that he would have to struggle through this alone. The young girl, sitting a row ahead, watched him with growing concern. She could see the tiny tremble in his fingers, the way he adjusted his glasses repeatedly, and the slight hesitation in his steps. It wasn't just that he was elderly, it was that he looked weary from more than just travel. There was a vulnerability about him that touched her, a quiet dignity mixed with helplessness, and something inside her stirred. She remembered the many times she had seen strangers or even family members silently struggling, unnoticed, and the thought made her heart tighten. She stood up, clutching her small backpack against her chest, and walked slowly toward him. She didn't want to startle him or make him feel embarrassed. As she approached, she smiled softly and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like to sit in my seat?" For a moment, the elderly man froze. His eyes widened slightly, and he blinked as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Your seat?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with surprise. "Yes," she replied warmly, her voice calm and reassuring, "I'm sitting here, but I'd like you to take my seat instead. It has more space, and you look like you could use a little comfort." He hesitated, glancing at the luxurious row of seats, then back at her. His lips pressed into a thin line as if he was trying to process the gesture. Around them, other passengers were quietly noticing, some smiling subtly, some looking away politely, giving the moment a sense of intimacy even in the middle of a bustling cabin. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I couldn't possibly." "Please," she interrupted softly, "I insist. You should be comfortable." The man's eyes glistened, and he nodded slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for her seatbelt, and she stepped aside to give him room. It was a small act, yet in that moment, it felt monumental. The young girl realized that sometimes, kindness didn't need fanfare. It was in these quiet, unspoken moments, the gestures that required no explanation, the acts that came purely from the heart. As he settled into the seat, adjusting the headrest and sinking slightly into the cushion, the man let out a deep breath, a sound of relief and gratitude that seemed to fill the first-class cabin. He looked at her and gave a small, shy smile, one that carried decades of life experience, challenges faced, and quiet humility. "Thank you," he said simply, but she could tell that the words barely scratched the surface of what he truly felt. She moved toward her own seat, slightly behind him, and found herself noticing the details she hadn't before, the way he straightened his jacket, the careful way he adjusted his glasses, the slow but deliberate way he took in his surroundings. Every small movement seemed meaningful, as if each action reflected a lifetime of patience, resilience, and quiet strength. Around them, the atmosphere shifted subtly. A few passengers exchanged glances, some smiling at the simple act of generosity unfolding before them. The cabin felt a little warmer, a little more human, and the young girl felt a glow of satisfaction deep inside her chest. It wasn't about recognition or praise, it was about seeing someone else experience relief and comfort in a world that often moved too fast to notice these things. The elderly man, now more settled, looked at her again and said, "You have a kind heart, young lady. I don't know how to thank you enough." She only smiled in return, feeling a quiet sense of joy, knowing that the gesture had already done more than words could express. And in that small, fleeting exchange, two strangers connected by empathy, by understanding, by the unspoken knowledge that a simple act could matter so much, the stage was set for something even more remarkable to happen. She didn't know it yet, but that one decision to offer her seat was about to create a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The young girl stood in the aisle for a moment, her heart pounding softly in her chest. She watched the elderly man settle into her seat, his movements careful and deliberate, the slight tremor in his hands now eased by the comfort of the spacious first-class row. There was a quiet dignity about him that made her decision feel even more significant. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about giving someone a small piece of ease in a world that often demanded constant effort from the elderly, a simple way to show respect and humanity. Her mind briefly flashed back to her own life, the times she had witnessed people struggle and gone past them without acting. The pang of guilt mixed with the warmth of empathy, creating a determination she hadn't fully realized she possessed until now. She knew that in this moment, she could either remain in the comfort of her assigned seat or step aside and allow someone else the relief he clearly needed. The choice was hers, and it felt heavier than it should for something so simple, yet the weight was welcome, it was the weight of doing something right. She inhaled deeply, feeling the soft hum of the airplane around her, the faint vibration through the floor, and the subtle rustle of passengers settling in. Everything else faded for a second, she only saw him, the way his eyes softened when he realized she genuinely meant what she had said. That look, it was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was relief, surprise, and perhaps even a flicker of hope that someone still cared about kindness in a world that often seemed rushed and uncaring. The young girl smiled gently, an inner warmth spreading through her chest, and said, "Please, it's really no trouble at all. You need it more than I do." Her words were simple, but there was a conviction in her tone that made it impossible to refuse. The elderly man hesitated again, glancing at her with a mixture of humility and astonishment. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly, almost as if he feared she might be testing him or had some hidden expectation. But the sincerity in her eyes reassured him, and slowly, he nodded, the corners of his lips curving into a gentle, grateful smile. There was something almost cinematic about the moment, two strangers connected through a gesture that cost one nothing but gave the other a great deal. The young girl felt a quiet thrill, not from pride, but from the knowledge that this small choice was already changing the energy around them. Passengers nearby were beginning to notice, some glancing over with soft smiles, while others simply observed silently, perhaps reminded of their own capacity for kindness. She began to move toward the economy section, careful not to rush or make the moment awkward. Every step felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though she were stepping into a new understanding of what it meant to act selflessly. She caught glimpses of the man adjusting his seatbelt, his expression transforming from tentative caution to quiet comfort. He leaned back slightly, as if releasing a tension she hadn't even realized he was holding, and she felt an unexpected emotional swell inside her. In that instant, she realized that decisions, even small ones, had power. A simple act like offering her seat could ripple out in ways she couldn't yet see, but the initial wave was already visible in his relieved smile and the subtle shift in his posture. She felt proud in the most genuine sense, not of herself, but of humanity, of the ability to respond with empathy in the moment when it mattered most. As she settled into her own seat just a few rows back, she allowed herself a brief glance over her shoulder. He was looking out the window now, but he turned to offer her a small nod of thanks, his eyes glimmering. That silent acknowledgement said more than words ever could. It was a thank you, a recognition of her heart, and a validation that kindness could be recognized without applause or fanfare. The plane began taxiing toward the runway, the low hum of engines vibrating through the cabin, but she hardly noticed the movement. She felt an awareness of the moment that transcended travel logistics, boarding routines, or flight schedules. This was human connection, pure, unexpected, and moving. She had made a decision, and in doing so, had quietly changed the course of this journey, not just for him, but perhaps for herself as well. In that small, ordinary act, she discovered the extraordinary, the realization that choosing kindness could be a decision that mattered far more than comfort, convenience, or routine. She leaned back in her seat, a soft smile tugging at her lips, waiting for what might come next, unaware that the true magic of the moment was still about to reveal itself. After the elderly man settled into her first-class seat, the young girl stepped aside, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and nervous curiosity. She walked slowly down the aisle, taking in the reactions of the passengers around them. Some had quietly noticed the gesture, giving her warm smiles or subtle nods of approval, while others glanced away, lost in their own routines. Even amidst the bustle of the cabin, there was a sense of calm that seemed to follow the man now occupying her seat, as if the small act of kindness had shifted the energy around them. The man adjusted himself carefully, testing the softness of the seat, his hands lingering on the armrests as he leaned back for a moment. His expression softened, and she could see the tension in his shoulders melt away slightly. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but she felt it keenly. The way he exhaled, the way his eyes scanned the spacious row before him, told her everything she needed to know. He was comfortable now, and for the first time in the airport chaos, he felt at ease. She moved to a middle-class seat just a few rows behind him, her backpack still clutched against her chest. The space felt smaller, more ordinary, but she didn't mind. In fact, she felt a quiet joy in the contrast. While she gave up comfort, someone else gained relief. There was something deeply satisfying about that exchange, and she settled into her seat with a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal comfort. Around them, the cabin hummed with the usual sounds of travel, flight attendants moving efficiently down the aisles, passengers chatting quietly or adjusting their luggage, the soft vibrations of the engines warming up in anticipation of takeoff. Yet amid this routine, the young girl noticed something remarkable. A few passengers who had initially ignored the elderly man now cast brief, approving glances toward him, perhaps reminded of their own potential for small acts of consideration. The ripple effect of her choice was subtle, but it was already unfolding. She watched him for a few moments, curious about how he would respond to her gesture. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the first-class comfort, and then softened as he glanced back at her. There was no grand expression of thanks, no dramatic display, just a quiet acknowledgement, a nod, a fleeting smile that said more than words ever could. It was a simple, human exchange that carried the weight of understanding, gratitude, and shared experience. The young girl felt a warm sensation in her chest, a mix of pride, humility, and hope. She realized that moments like this didn't need to be publicized to matter, they existed for the quiet impact they had on individual lives. This small, seemingly insignificant decision had already made a difference, and yet, she sensed that the story wasn't finished. Something about the man, his gentle presence, and the soft light streaming through the airplane windows hinted that this moment was only the beginning. As she settled into her own seat, she noticed the man pulling out a small notebook from his coat pocket. He adjusted his glasses and began writing carefully, his pen moving slowly across the page. She couldn't see what he was writing, but the deliberate, thoughtful way he held the pen suggested that it was more than a casual note. It carried intention, reflection, and perhaps gratitude that words alone couldn't easily convey. Her curiosity grew, but she resisted the urge to peek. This was a moment meant to unfold naturally, and she wanted to respect it. Around them, the flight attendants continued their tasks, guiding passengers, offering drinks, and adjusting trays, but the girl's attention remained fixed on the elderly man. She felt a connection to him that transcended words, a recognition of humanity, of kindness, of the shared understanding that small gestures could carry enormous meaning. The plane, the passengers, and the routine of travel faded into the background, leaving only the quiet, intimate space between two strangers whose lives had unexpectedly intersected. The engines began to roar softly, signaling that the plane was preparing for takeoff, but her mind was elsewhere. She realized that giving up her seat had not been a sacrifice at all. Instead, it had been a choice that enriched her own experience, opening her eyes to the unexpected rewards of empathy and thoughtfulness. The transition was complete, not just physically, from one seat to another, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. She had crossed a threshold, and she could feel, even in the quiet hum of the airplane cabin, that something remarkable was about to happen. With that thought lingering in her mind, she leaned back in her seat, quietly observing the man as he continued to write. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible, like the pause before a story's most meaningful moment, and she felt a sense of calm excitement. Whatever was coming next, she knew it would be unforgettable. The young girl settled into her middle-class seat, still stealing quiet glances at the elderly man who now occupied her first-class row. He seemed calmer, more at ease, yet there was a thoughtful intensity in his movements. He reached slowly into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the edges frayed as though it had traveled with him for years. The way he handled it suggested it was important, perhaps even precious, and the girl felt a curious flutter of anticipation. At first, he just stared at the page, pen poised above it, as if gathering his thoughts carefully. Then, with deliberate care, he began to write. The pen scratched lightly against the paper, and each movement seemed meaningful, like a rhythm of thought being transformed into something tangible. She could not see the words, but the way he leaned forward, shoulders slightly hunched, and the deep concentration in his eyes told her that this was no ordinary note. There was an intention, a weight to it, as though he was trying to capture the essence of a feeling too large for casual expression. Around them, the plane was settling into the familiar hum of mid-flight. Passengers were reading, listening to music, or dozing, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding in the first-class cabin. The girl, however, felt a sense of suspense building, as though she were on the edge of something profound. She couldn't help but wonder what he might be writing. Would it be a simple thank you, a story, or something entirely unexpected? Her curiosity was matched by a subtle nervousness. She realized that the next few minutes could change the tone of their encounter forever. Finally, the elderly man folded the note carefully, almost reverently, as if the words inside held more value than gold. He glanced toward the young girl, a gentle smile forming on his lips, and then he carefully got up from the seat, making sure not to disturb anyone around him. With deliberate steps, he walked down the aisle toward her, his movements slower than usual but measured with purpose. Every passenger he passed seemed to sense the quiet importance of what was happening, yet no one interrupted or asked questions. It was as though the plane itself had paused, giving this small, intimate moment the space it deserved. When he reached her seat, he hesitated for a brief moment, almost shyly, and extended the folded piece of paper toward her. I wrote something for you, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with sincerity. It's a small token of gratitude. She reached for the note, feeling its weight in her hands, and carefully unfolded it. The words inside were written with clear, deliberate penmanship, each line carrying an emotion that seemed almost palpable. It was more than just a thank you note, it was a story, a glimpse into his life. He wrote about moments of struggle, of hardship and loneliness, and how her small gesture of offering her seat had brought him comfort in a way he had not expected. There were words of wisdom, of reflection, and a heartfelt acknowledgement of her kindness. She could feel the depth of his gratitude and the humility behind it, as if he were offering her not only thanks but a piece of his life and heart. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, unbidden but gentle, as she read through each carefully chosen word. She had known her action was kind, but she had not realized its impact would reach so deeply. The elderly man had transformed her simple gesture into a profound connection, reminding her that the smallest acts could resonate in ways she could never fully predict. Around them, the hum of the plane continued, but it felt distant, irrelevant, overshadowed by the quiet, intense emotion of the moment. She looked up at him, her own smile soft and emotional, and he returned it with a gentle nod, eyes glimmering with warmth. There was no need for grand statements or dramatic displays. The note itself had spoken louder than any words could. It was a bridge between two lives, a shared recognition of empathy, humanity, and the extraordinary power of ordinary choices. For a few minutes, they simply sat there, exchanging smiles and quiet acknowledgement, the note resting in her lap like a small treasure. Passengers nearby might have seen only two strangers in a cabin, but she understood that this was more than that. It was a moment suspended in time, a reminder that compassion could create ripples far beyond its origin, and that connection could happen in the quietest, most unexpected ways. As she folded the note and tucked it carefully into her bag, she realized something important. The act of giving, even in the smallest form, had returned to her in the most profound way. It was not about recognition or reward, it was about the shared human experience, about the knowledge that kindness, when offered sincerely, had the power to touch lives in ways she could never have imagined. The young girl carefully unfolded the note, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of anticipation. Even before reading the words, she felt the care with which it had been written, the deliberate loops of the pen, the space left between sentences, as though each pause held meaning. She realized this was not just a note, it was a story, a glimpse into the life of someone who had carried more than his fair share of struggles and, somehow, still found gratitude in the world. As her eyes moved across the paper, she began to understand the depth behind his words. He described moments in his life that had been difficult, lonely nights, times when even small comforts were out of reach, and days when he had felt invisible to the world. The young girl felt a pang in her heart as she read about the challenges he had endured, the quiet resilience that had carried him this far. And then, toward the middle of the note, he wrote about her gesture. "I have lived many years," the note began, "and I have learned that kindness is rare. Today, you reminded me that it still exists. The seat you offered me is not just a seat, it is respect, dignity, and consideration wrapped into a single, human act. You saw me, and that is more than many have done." The girl paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity and gravity of the message. It was one thing to help someone, it was another to realize that such a small action could resonate so deeply, touching a heart that had endured so much. She felt a lump rise in her throat, a mixture of pride, humility, and awe, as if she were witnessing the tangible impact of a single, selfless choice. The note continued, weaving together gratitude and reflection. He wrote about the lessons he had learned over a lifetime, the importance of noticing others, of showing care even when no one is watching. He explained that her action had reminded him of the best parts of humanity, of the quiet, unseen goodness that exists even in a world that often feels harsh and indifferent. In that brief moment, he wrote, "You made me feel seen, respected, and valued. That feeling will remain with me long after this flight." As she read, her heart swelled with a sense of connection. She realized that kindness was not just about grand gestures or heroic acts, it was in these quiet, intimate moments that true human connection occurred. One person offering a small piece of comfort could touch another in ways that were immeasurable. She imagined the life experiences he had carried into that moment, the challenges and victories, the invisible burdens, and understood that her single choice had intersected with years of story and memory. The elderly man had also written a small piece of advice, something he wanted her to carry forward. "Remember, young one, that kindness is never wasted. Even when it seems unnoticed, even when it feels small, it is a thread in the fabric of this world. You have woven a golden thread today, and I hope you continue to do so wherever you go." Tears formed in the corners of her eyes, unbidden but inevitable. She folded the note gently, pressing it to her chest for a moment, and looked up at him. His eyes met hers with a quiet warmth that conveyed more than words ever could. There was no need for additional thanks, the note itself was a bridge, a shared understanding of humanity and empathy that transcended the words on the page. Around them, the cabin hummed with activity, flight attendants moving down the aisles, passengers adjusting to the flight, but the moment between them felt suspended in time. It was intimate, powerful, and entirely transformative. The young girl realized that this small act of offering her seat had created ripples far beyond what she could see. She had not only helped him feel comfortable but had given him a renewed sense of hope and connection. For the first time, she fully grasped the true impact of empathy and human kindness. It was a force that could travel unseen, touching hearts, inspiring reflection, and even changing the course of someone's day, or, in this case, someone's life. In that quiet exchange, she felt an incredible sense of purpose and clarity. Acts of compassion were not just moments of generosity, they were lifelines, threads connecting people across the invisible gaps of experience and emotion. She looked at him once more, the note still held carefully in her hands, and realized that their lives had intersected in a moment that would remain with both of them forever. The seat she had offered, the gesture she had almost dismissed as simple, had created a bond, a shared memory, and a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary choices. The young girl sat back in her seat, the note still clutched gently in her hands, and felt a wave of emotion she hadn't anticipated. Her chest was tight, her eyes slightly misty, and yet she felt a deep warmth that spread from her heart outward, as if the simple act of giving and receiving had unlocked something within her. She looked across the aisle at the elderly man, who was now quietly observing her with a soft, knowing smile, and in that moment, it felt as though no words were necessary. The connection between them transcended language. It was human, intimate, and profoundly moving. Around them, the airplane continued its steady hum, passengers adjusting, chatting, and moving about, but the young girl felt as if they were in a world apart, a small bubble of stillness and understanding suspended above the clouds. She realized that her initial nervousness when offering her seat had been replaced by a sense of calm and clarity. Something inside her had shifted. Kindness, she now understood, was not just a gesture, it was an energy that traveled beyond the moment, lingering in hearts, leaving an indelible impression that could ripple outward in unexpected ways. She glanced at the man again. His posture had relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, but there was a quiet dignity in his demeanor that seemed to glow. The note he had written wasn't just gratitude, it was a reflection of a life well lived, tempered with hardships, yet open to kindness and humanity. She imagined his years of experience, the challenges, the victories, the loneliness he may have felt, and understood how her one small choice had momentarily lifted a weight from him, offering not just comfort, but acknowledgement and respect. Tears threatened to fall again, but she held them back, feeling the full force of the moment. The emotional impact was not hers alone, she could sense it extending outward, touching others nearby. She noticed subtle reactions in the passengers around them, a woman adjusting her child with a gentle smile, a man glancing briefly at the first-class row with softened eyes, a flight attendant moving through the aisle with a warmer, lighter step. Even without knowing the details, they had witnessed a story of humanity unfold before them, and the energy of that quiet, powerful exchange had reached them in ways she could only imagine. For the young girl, the lesson was unmistakable, empathy and generosity had power. She realized that kindness wasn't measured by grand gestures or dramatic displays, it was measured by the effect it had on the hearts it touched. In offering her seat, she had participated in a human story that would live far beyond the physical moment. She felt an unspoken understanding that life was made up of these seemingly ordinary decisions, and that each one had the potential to create extraordinary outcomes. The elderly man, sensing her gaze, gave a small nod, a gesture of mutual understanding that conveyed volumes. There was no need for more words, the note had said it all, yet the silent acknowledgement between them spoke even louder. In his eyes, she saw appreciation, warmth, and a recognition of her courage to act selflessly. In hers, he saw the ripple of impact that kindness could create, validating his own belief in human goodness. As the plane continued to cruise above the clouds, the young girl reflected on the depth of the experience. Her emotions were a mix of humility and joy, awe and gratitude. She understood now that human connection could arise in the most unexpected places, often from the simplest gestures. A seat offered, a moment of attention, a small act of thoughtfulness, these could leave impressions that lasted far longer than the passengers would remain on the plane. The emotional resonance lingered as she tucked the note carefully into her bag, feeling it as a treasure. It wasn't about recognition or reward, it was about awareness, empathy, and the quiet power of actions taken from the heart. She realized she would carry this moment with her for years to come, a reminder that even small choices could have profound consequences. Finally, she looked at the man one last time before turning toward the window, watching the clouds drift past. He gave her a gentle, knowing smile once more, and in that smile, she saw the reflection of something universal, gratitude, connection, and the human capacity to impact one another's lives, even in fleeting moments. The emotional impact of their encounter had already begun to ripple outward, touching hearts in ways neither of them could fully see, yet both could deeply feel. As the plane hummed steadily along its flight path, the young girl leaned back in her seat, her hands still gently holding the small note that had changed the tone of her journey. The clouds outside the window drifted lazily beneath the wings, bathed in the soft glow of the sun filtering through the cabin, but her mind was far from the scenery. She was replaying every moment, the decision to offer her seat, the grateful smile of the elderly man, the careful words he had written. Each memory felt like a thread woven into a tapestry of human connection, and she could feel its warmth stretching beyond the physical confines of the airplane. It occurred to her that the act she had initially thought of as simple had been anything but ordinary. It had become a lesson, an unexpected teacher, showing her that the smallest choices could carry immense weight. She realized that kindness wasn't something measured in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, it was in noticing someone else, in pausing to offer comfort, in the courage to act when it's easier to look away. A single seat had become a symbol of something much larger: empathy, humanity, and the quiet but transformative power of thoughtfulness. She glanced over at the elderly man, now relaxed in her former seat, reading a small book with a serene expression on his face. He looked entirely at peace, and she could see how something as simple as being acknowledged had given him a renewed sense of dignity. She smiled softly, realizing that her choice had not only impacted him but had shifted something within herself as well. There was a lightness in her chest, a subtle but undeniable understanding that she had participated in something meaningful, a reminder that life often offers opportunities to touch others in profound ways if one is willing to notice. The plane cabin moved around them in its routine rhythm, passengers chatting softly, attendants gliding down aisles, the gentle vibration of the engines, but for the young girl, time felt suspended. She thought about how fleeting moments could carry the deepest significance, how chance encounters could leave lasting imprints. She reflected on the idea that acts of kindness were not transactional, they did not demand recognition, repayment, or applause. Their value lay in their sincerity and the way they connected human hearts, even for a brief, passing instant. She felt gratitude in a way she had never expected, not for herself, but for the experience, for the opportunity to witness the ripple of her actions, and for the reminder that the world still held genuine, quiet beauty. Her thoughts drifted further. The elderly man had reminded her, through his note and his demeanor, that life was filled with challenges, but that hope and warmth could persist even in small gestures. A single act could become a beacon, illuminating paths for both the giver and the receiver. The young girl considered the lessons she would carry beyond this flight. She would remember to pause, to notice, to extend kindness even when it required little sacrifice and when the world seemed too busy to care. She would remember that empathy could be stronger than circumstance, that respect could bridge generations, and that genuine attention could transform ordinary moments into unforgettable ones. Life, she realized, was a series of choices, some so small they seemed insignificant, yet capable of shaping memories, emotions, and futures. As she glanced one last time at the elderly man, she noticed the way he had returned to writing quietly in his notebook, perhaps recording thoughts inspired by the journey or reflecting on her gesture. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered a soft nod, as if acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. In that silent exchange, she felt the depth of human connection, the invisible threads that tie strangers together through kindness, respect, and empathy. The plane began its descent, and the realization dawned on her that this journey would not end with the landing. She would carry the memory of this encounter into her life, sharing it through her actions, letting it influence the way she treated others in small and meaningful ways. She understood that every choice mattered, every gesture held potential, and that the world could be shaped, one thoughtful act at a time. As the wheels touched the runway and the engines softened their roar, she tucked the note carefully into her bag, feeling a quiet satisfaction that could not be measured. The young girl had learned something profound, that kindness is contagious, empathy is powerful, and human connections, unexpected, fleeting, and sincere, are among life's greatest treasures. She leaned back, breathing deeply, knowing that today, a single choice had changed more than one life. It had created a memory, a lesson, and a story she would carry forever.